Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you all for being here. So it is a true pleasure to get to introduce today's speaker and a close friend. So I'm very excited to hearing about Alex's research. So Alexandra McAuliff is a postdoctoral or a doctoral candidate in international relations at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a visiting researcher at the program on negotiation at the Harvard Law School. Her work focuses broadly on gender, negotiations, and conflict resolution. Her dissertation research examines the peace process in Northern Ireland and specifically explores the gendered power dynamics of peace negotiations and the implications for enduring peace and stability. McAuliff is also part of a cross-university research team working on questions related to migration, foreign policy, and diplomacy, and oversees the Civil Resistance Fellowship at the Fletcher School. Her work has been published in International Negotiation and supported by the Program on Negotiation, World Peace Foundation, and the Henry J. Lear Institute for Migration and Human Security. Prior to pursuing her doctoral degree, she worked as a dialogue facilitator both in Northern Ireland and at Seeds of Peace, a youth-focused leadership organization. Our speaker will present for 50 minutes, and then we'll have a 25-minute time period for questions from our audience. We ask that you hold your questions until the end of the talk. For those of you on Zoom, please type your answer in the Q&A function, and I will be managing the online Q&A. We also ask that any audience questions be very brief, be on topic, and be posed in the form of a question. And we love when it's related to our researchers or our presenters' research. So please join me in welcoming Alexandra McAuliff. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah and Elizabeth. Just before I get started, I want to make a brief plug for the gender conference at the Fletcher School is happening this Friday and Saturday. And it's something that when I was a master's student, I was involved in. I think it was the second and third annual gender conference on international affairs. And now they're in their 9th year, and it's completely student run and really on the kind of cutting edge of a lot of questions related to all things related to gender and international affairs. It's both in-person and hybrid. So wherever you are in the world, you can register and sign up to attend. And I think Anisha is going to put the link in the chat for those of you online. So with that, today I'm going to be talking about a slice of my dissertation research, which does focus on Northern Ireland. And if you've been part of the series since the beginning, we've kind of been working our way through how we think about gender and inclusion within negotiations. And so today I'm going to be thinking a little bit more about what the actual negotiation dynamics are within the process. So just a brief overview. Well, I'll give you some context and background, explain why I even talk about Northern Ireland today, 25 years later, the methodology I used, what I call the logics of inclusion, and then my argument of gender as a peace hierarchy within negotiations, and the impacts of what this means. So as Elizabeth noted in my bio, I worked as a dialogue facilitator before coming to grad school, and I worked as a dialogue facilitator in Northern Ireland. And I think it's useful to tell a story that highlights where this research kind of came from. Because in 2015, I was working as a dialogue facilitator, and this small organization in Northern Ireland ran dialogues all over the region. But in this particular one, we were working with a group of women in the basement of a community center. And they said, as we were going, we are ready for peace. And I remember being confused when they said this because it was 2015. The agreement that had ended the 30 years of what was known as the Troubles had been signed in 1998. And so I was thinking, what do they mean they're ready for peace? If they've had peace for the last 17 years. But what they went on to explain was that many of the ways that they felt insecurity during the Troubles had not significantly changed for them 17 years later. Yes, they were very, they recognized the importance that like the everyday kind of direct violence happening every day had ended, but many of the ways that they felt insecurity had not abated. For example, paramilitary intimidation continued to be rife in many areas. Economic insecurity was always kind of in the background. The regular collapse of the government that had been put in place by the agreement meant that often just basic services were difficult to come by or unavailable. In other words, they really felt that the peace dividend hadn't reached them. And as maybe kind of basic as these laments may seem, they fly in the face of a lot of what has been articulated within peace negotiation and women's inclusion literature in particular. That if we get women into that room, then women's experiences will be better represented in the peace outcomes that we see. But women were included in the Northern Irish peace negotiations. And yet these women were still saying, our experience, we don't feel has been recognized. And so this puzzle has really driven a lot of my research. What's going on in these negotiations if even when women are there, the impacts for real women's lives are not being felt? And so the contributions that my research makes is to really further question this idea that descriptive representation, being in the room, does not necessarily equal substantive representation. The ability to meaningfully produce meaningful outcomes or to influence the process. Second, that gender is not just a variable in negotiations, but a power structure within them. And then finally, some contributions to negotiation theory in terms of how we think about gender and influence within negotiations. And so to do this, I ask, how does power shape peace negotiations in terms of structures, norms, and outcomes? To what extent can women's inclusion impact the process, and what are the limits? And how do negotiated outcomes influence women's lived experiences of insecurity? And today, and what I'll talk about today, I really focus on these first two. How power shapes the negotiations, and to what extent can women's inclusion actually impact the process? And as a bit of a spoiler, what I argue and what I find is that peace negotiations are informed by a hierarchy of peace that is fundamentally shaped by gender. So in other words, the people, the ideas, and the practices that are feminized are deemed insignificant, inconsequential, and secondary for peace. And so just to give you really, really brief background on Northern Ireland, so that we're all on the same page. In 1921, Ireland was partitioned into Northern Ireland and what later became the Republic of Ireland. And it was partitioned explicitly or specifically to ensure that there was a Protestant majority in the north and a Catholic minority. And this led to significant discrimination against those Catholic Irish individuals in the form of employment, housing. They were basically gerrymandered out of any political representation. And so in the 1960s, following the civil rights movement in the United States, but also globally, there were peaceful protests across Northern Ireland. And eventually they were met with violence, and the British government sent in British troops. And thus began 30 years of conflict between what is known as the Irish Republican Army, which is basically a paramilitary group, the British Army, and loyalist paramilitaries. And I'll just say a brief note on language. So for the purposes of today, I am referring to Catholic Irish nationalist Republican as those who see themselves as belonging to part of Ireland, and use Protestant Unionist loyalist for those who see themselves as belonging to the United Kingdom. That is a vast, vast, vast oversimplification of the identities. We could have a whole session on the differences among those different identities and what they mean. But for the sake of simplicity, since this isn't a talk on identity per se, that's what I mean when I use those terms. And for those who don't know, Northern Ireland today is considered part of the United Kingdom. Now, in 1996, the British and Irish governments announced, after many years of back-channel negotiations, that there would be elections to decide who would participate in peace talks. And a group of women got together. They had long roots in women's activism and feminist organizing in Northern Ireland, and were very concerned that their experiences would not be represented in the negotiations. And they reached out to the different political parties and both governments and said, please ensure that there's some kind of gender representation here. And they heard nothing back. And so they decided to start their own political party. Now, they had 6 weeks between when the elections were announced and when the elections would take place. So they started a political party from scratch, recruited women from all across Northern Ireland to join the party, and convinced 70 women to stand for election, which was more than any other party that was running in the election. They had more candidates than anybody else. And they were successful. They got enough votes to earn a seat in the negotiations and at the table. And the first headline after the elections, women given a seat at the table or a place at the table, kind of tells you everything you need to know about the delegitimization of women's political organizing. It wasn't what they did, they were given it by the benevolent parties. Now, you might be asking, why even talk about Northern Ireland? This took place 25 years ago. By and large, it's been a relatively peaceful place since then. What are we talking about today? And that 25 years is actually a really important point, because that 25 years allows us that longitudinal perspective to understand, okay, this is what happened in the negotiations. This is what provisions were included. This is what women were trying to get in. And this is how that's played out. This has been the reality, what's worked and what hasn't worked. But then also, Northern Ireland has really had, in many respects, every advantage for peace. So they had the British government and the Irish government driving the process. So two committed democracies really putting their full weight behind the process. It also had the full political and personal investment of the United States president. And then finally, the process took place under the auspices of the EU, which has donated over €1 billion to the peace process. So it's really invested in the peace process. And again, while no one is saying that the ending of that, bombs going off in the street is not an important piece of it, significant issues still exist. So paramilitaries continue to control many areas in Northern Ireland. Schools are still 93% segregated, so kids are schooled separately. The government that was put in place by the Good Friday Agreement hasn't functioned for almost 50% of the time. And then people continue to live vastly segregated. So you can see here, this is just the city of Belfast, and populations, this is mainly Protestant, mainly Catholic, and then these are called interface areas where they're the two communities kind of abut one another. And in these areas, these red lines are what are known as peace walls, which are actually kind of the opposite of what they sound like, where they are walls, massive, massive walls, concrete, with wiring on the top to keep communities separate. And the number of those peace walls, this is one, has actually increased since the agreement was signed. So there's a real question here of, like, if this is our best example, the very best we can do 25 years on, and it's the example that's really been exported all over the world, is like, look at what they did in Northern Ireland. They did it. If this is the best example, there's some real questions that we have to ask about how do we move this from simply kind of what we think of as negative peace, just ending the violence, keeping it at bay, to meaningfully engaging with these kind of root causes of conflicts and the real manifestations of the ways that this division, that this conflict is still very, very, very present in people's lives. This morning in the Belfast Telegraph, there was an article about the UVF, which is a loyalist paramilitary group. The number of paramilitary groups has actually increased also since the agreement was signed. So again, if this is the best we can do, there seems to be a lot of room for improvement. And so how I tried to look at this, and again, looking at how power is operating within negotiations, what's happening and what impact can women have, I approached it from a feminist and interpretivist perspective, which basically is, I'm not trying to make causal claims to say, to have a hypothesis and test it, but to rather say, okay, how is power and gender working within negotiations? What's happening here? And to also acknowledge that, you know, what we think often as universally known doesn't necessarily apply to everybody, or isn't necessarily universal, or who's constructed in that universal. Because knowledge is created in the social context in which it exists. So much as the women in my dialogue session were saying, if this is peace, I don't know what that means, because this is not, our lives are not peaceful. For whom is peace defined? These women were saying, it's not been defined for us. So this interpretivist perspective is really trying to be able to dig below some of these questions. But then I also take an approach that's known as studying up. And this comes from Laura Nader, who was an anthropologist in the 1970s. And she suggested that if we shift how we're framing questions, we get totally different answers. And her example was saying, you know, instead of asking, why are there so many poor people in the United States? What if we asked, why is so much wealth concentrated at the very top? Why do so few people have so much money? And that totally flips the answers that you're getting and the solutions that are put forward. And so similarly in this work, rather than saying, why can't the people of Northern Ireland live together? Why aren't women having more of an impact in negotiations? I'm really trying to look at, okay, how are those in power constructing the conditions for peace? And I did this through fieldwork in Northern Ireland, primarily through archives, interviews, and participant observation. And for the archives, I spent time at 3 different archives that kind of house different types of documents. So the first were government papers. And so these were, for example, this is a daily report from the different negotiation officials back to Dublin, back to London, reporting on what had happened that day, who had talked to whom, what did they talk about, what were the sticking points. So very kind of intimate look at what was being said at the time. And then I also was able to access party papers. So this, for example, is an attendance list from one of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition's first meetings. So really, these papers allowed me to look internally at the Women's Coalition, what they were saying within themselves, and then what they were advocating within the broader negotiation, and what those tensions were and how they were navigating them. And then finally, actual negotiation documents and papers. So plenary minutes, internal memos, position papers. And this was actually at the time, a secret letter from Tony Blair, the then prime minister, to one of the lead negotiators, David Trimble, who was the last one to kind of come over the line to say yes to the agreement. And this was his like secret letter to get him over the line. And so these papers really allow me to trace the negotiations at kind of a very, granular level of what was in the negotiations on the agenda from the beginning, what was considered, a must-have versus what was kind of pushed in there. How were the Women's Coalition seen as legitimate actors? All of these things that I was able to trace through these papers. But then I augmented this with interviews. Interviews with the key government officials who were part of the engineering and the design and the conduct of the negotiations. So they were there every day. Also some of the what are known as private secretaries, so more of like the administrative people taking the notes in the meetings, the flies on the walls, which was very interesting because they didn't really have a stake in representing to me in a certain way what the negotiations did or didn't do. They were just doing their jobs. But then also I met with members of the Northern Ireland office, which was kind of like the bureaucratic and governance office of the British government in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition members, and then gender activists and civil service providers today and their reflections on what's happening today. And I'm more than happy in the Q&A to talk about both archives themselves as like a power structure in terms of what's deemed relevant to be kept, and also what it means to be doing interviews 25 years after the fact and how I dealt with some of those dynamics. And then lastly, I did participant observation. So I spent quite a while in Northern Ireland, and as one can imagine, as I'm writing my dissertation now, that I was slightly impacted by COVID-19, and doing face-to-face research and international research during a pandemic was not a good combination. But the silver lining was that because of those delays, my fieldwork ended up taking place in the lead up to the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And so this meant that there was a lot of kind of public thinking about what had happened, what the agreement had accomplished and what it hadn't accomplished. A lot of actors kind of coming out of the woodwork to participate in these different panels and things. And so these pictures here are from the culmination of these events. And this was called Agreement 25. And it was kind of an international celebration of all the biggest names you could possibly think of who were involved. So this here is George Mitchell, who was one of the chairmen to the negotiations. It's very interesting in like anybody I think you would talk to within negotiation literature who does negotiation, he would be generally considered part of the mediation panel. But everybody I talked to from Ireland and Great Britain who were part of the negotiations, he was not a mediator. They were not mediators. They were simply chairman, kind of directing the process. So very interesting construction of his role depending on who you talk to. But then also, you probably will recognize Hillary Clinton, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, and Bertie Ahern, who was the prime minister of Ireland at the time. And again, there's a whole nother talk to be given on, what this event says about how peace is being defined, who is on the stage, who is seen as central to this process versus who was invited to be in the audience versus who wasn't invited at all. And you'll never guess, but all of the women's organizers who were on the ground leading the kind of grassroots peace building, very few of them were invited. So there's a very interesting story just in and of how the peace is defined and commemorated today. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda and 1325 because I think for those of you who've been here, you've heard about it every single week. And so I think you generally know what we're talking about here. But I am going to talk about what I call the logics of inclusion, which are kind of the primary tenets of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda in terms of how women's inclusion in negotiations is articulated and advocated. And I say that there's three. A logic of instrumentalization, a logic of justice, and a logic of socialization. And the logic of socialization, or excuse me, of justice, is actually the least frequently used in advocacy and in literature, I would say. But it's the idea that women have a right to participate in processes that so directly impact their lives. So it's a matter of morality, of fairness. But more frequently used are the logics, the instrumental logic and the socialization logic. And I think these are, you'll see, they're very mutually constituting, but I think there's value in trying to pull them apart a little bit. And so the logic of instrumentalization is this idea that peace agreements that include women are more successful. So we know that they're more likely to reach a negotiated settlement when women are included. Peace is more likely to endure, 20% more likely to last 2 years, 35% more likely to last 15 years, and that the process is viewed as more legitimate by the public. So the argument here is really what women can do for you, what women can do for the process. And the logic of socialization is almost trying to give the why. Why do we think we see better outcomes when women are included? And there's, I think, two different socialization ideas that we see, and both very much kind of rely on a bit of a generalization about women and this idea that, it takes a bit of a non-intersectional lens in the idea that all women are equally kind of oppressed within society, and doesn't really articulate the ways that different identities will intersect differently, placing women at different types of vulnerabilities and strengths within conflict. But so the first is this, what's often called the women in peace hypothesis, that because of the way women are socialized, they're more empathetic, less aggressive, less threatening, and more willing to compromise. So because of this socialization, women are better at peace. And the second is that because of gender roles and socialization, women experience conflict differently than men. And we know that sexual violence is often used as a weapon of war, particularly against women. We saw this in Bosnia, and this is systematic use of sexual violence against women. We know that there are increases in domestic and intimate partner violence before, during, and after violent conflict. That often, because not exclusively, but often it is men that are called to military duty, that there's women who are left behind to maintain the community and the family. In Ukraine, for example, UN Women has reported that 2/3 of women have been internally displaced, which has huge implications for women's experiences of security and violence. And then finally, that economic roles and responsibilities often change during conflict as well. Women taking on more economic independence and responsibilities more generally. So we know that there are differences in how women experience conflict and violence. And indeed, the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition used really this socialization logic, that they have views on issues and problems facing themselves, and that women played a vital role in sustaining their communities over the years. And so wanting this role and this expertise to be in the process and reflected in the process. And I think these logics are important in underlining these gender differences, but I argue that they don't tell us the whole story. They treat women or gender as a variable rather than understanding how it's embedded in the context of conflict and peace. So first is that the first of the shortcomings, perhaps, is that these logics still kind of treat what we call the women's inclusion as the add women and stir model. So even though we know that that doesn't work, that just adding women into a process and then assuming everything will be fine from there, we know that that doesn't work. The literature on negotiation hasn't really gotten beyond that of, okay, how do we ensure that when women are there, they have the power to influence the process? Because without that, we really, the argument becomes, okay, just get women to the table, and then we just assume that all of the political, historical, and social dynamics that have kept women out for all of these years will somehow just evaporate, and women will be able to influence the process with just as much power as any of the other actors, which really, as I'll demonstrate, isn't the case. And second, these logics divorce women from political agency. So you might have noticed that all three of the, well, particularly the socialization and the instrumentalization logic, they articulate women's contributions simply as a function of moving through the world as women. There's no recognition of the political beliefs, expertise, and ideology that women might hold, the very specific types of expertise that and experience that women bring to the table. So for example, members of the Women's Coalition had tremendous experience working cross-community. They had worked in trade unions, on trade union negotiation. They had worked in activism and organizing. So they had all these skills that they brought to bear far beyond just having experienced the world as women, which is important, but it's not everything. And by failing to recognize that, we're really selling women's political agency short. But then it puts the onus for change on women. So we know there's problems with how negotiations take place. And the idea that we just include women and the most marginalized and the least powerful will be able to change all the things that are wrong with negotiations puts an awful lot of pressure and burden on those with the least amount of power to do so. And then finally, they fail to understand gender as a power structure. And this is where I build my research, is this understanding of gender as an analytical category, that gender is more than just something that I embody. It's more than what we perform or express, but that it is a set of power relations, organizing relation within our society. And what this really means is that gender is something that is constructed as a dichotomous variable where what is masculine is constructed in opposition to what is feminine, and we more highly value what is associated with masculinity. And what is associated with masculinity is assumed to be the natural way of things, and it is what is associated with femininity or other that is othered and different. And this is not by any stretch of the imagination to say that gender is a binary, but rather to say as a power structure, that's how it's organized so that we can highly value what is seen as masculine and devalue everything and everybody else. And this isn't necessarily fixed. We've seen changes over time. For example, in the Industrial Revolution, factory labor became feminized so that we could take advantage of women's labor and pay them less. So these things shift and change over time, but what remains constant is what becomes associated with masculinity is more highly valued. So what does this have to do with peace negotiations? Well, feminist scholars have articulated for us, Ann Tickner, Laura Schoberg, Cynthia Enlow, lots of feminist scholars, that the state is masculine. It was constructed as a masculine project. So if you put on kind of your traditional or conventional international relations hat and think back to how is the modern state system perceived and constructed, the Westphalian state system. What are the primary tenets? Sovereignty, bureaucracy, and the legitimate monopoly on the use of force. The state is protecting its sovereignty, its borders from the dangerous out there, and protecting the imagined inside of the state. And who typically protects those borders? It is the military, typically populated historically, not exclusively, but by men. And so masculinity and what it means to be a soldier become deeply intertwined in toughness and the protector, protecting the insides of the state. And who is on this within this imagined internal safe state place? It's the women who are being protected. And I say imagined because we know that states have not historically, nor do they continue to be, the greatest insurers of women's security. But this is how this imagined idea of who protects and who is protected within the state construct is made. And indeed, historically, the state has ceded that control or that responsibility for securing women's interests to the male head of household, such that all of the things that become associated with this private domesticated sphere are no longer the concern of the state. It's no longer related to state security. So the ways that we see more intimate violence, the role of the community, relationships, these are domesticated, private, not big P politics, not relevant to the security of the state. And indeed, in the peace negotiations in Northern Ireland, the negotiations were constructed as returning the monopoly of violence to the state. So the negotiations were constructed as an act of, or to the purpose of sovereignty and security, meaning that it was about translating violent conflict into legal and security structures. And so all of the ways that violence is perpetrated and perpetuated at every level of society, all of the ways that it is fomented at every level of society, and the ways that violence impacts every level of society is not central to the negotiation effort. It's about the security and the sovereignty aspects. And what this means then is that if you are seen and what you are seen to represent is external to that construction, so women and feminized issues, then you too become secondary in importance to this effort. And indeed, one of my interlocutors said, I almost had the sense that to some extent, these things were regarded as soft, you know, almost women's work, as you might say, where it was guns and parliaments and constitutional texts. These were the real stuff of negotiation. And we saw in Northern Ireland that it was security normalization, policing, decommissioning of weapons, criminal justice, governance, all of these more hard big P politic issues that were the priority. And one of the government officials that I interviewed said to me, well, of course we needed to have policing reform with the decommissioning of weapons, because how could we possibly have policing reform, which was very important in this context, if there were caches of weapons all over Northern Ireland? Which, okay, sure, that makes sense. But then one might also say, how could we possibly have a shared system of governance if we have no mutual civic understanding, if we've never lived together, if we've never been schooled together, if we have no shared understanding of history? And so the question is not really, should we be doing one or the other? I think you can make the argument that both are critical for enduring peace, but the question is really, why are we prioritizing one to the complete exclusion of the other? And if a party or a people or an entity is constructed as secondary and outside what is necessary for the negotiations, then they fundamentally become a lower power party in the process. They are not necessarily necessary. And that's exactly the position that the Women's Coalition found themselves in. As one said to me, we had no paramilitary wing. They couldn't say, if we don't get X, we're walking away. They had no power to say that. The negotiations, they wanted peace, and the negotiations was their only option. So as we call that in negotiations literature, a best alternative to a negotiated agreement, a BATNA. They didn't have one. The negotiations were their only option. And what this meant is that at the end of the day, we knew that the Women's Coalition would go along with whatever consensus was emerging. So that's really why we didn't have to worry too much about them. Nobody was very concerned that their interests be met because they knew they couldn't go there. And so fundamentally, this meant that there was very little power over leverage that the Women's Coalition had. But while they didn't direct power over leverage, they built indirect leverage and power in other ways. The first being procedural leverage. So they really used the process to build their own leverage within it. They advocated for voting changes to how issues were decided within the negotiations so that it couldn't be a majority rule, so that the parties couldn't move on without them, but actually it had to be a consensus building effort so that their voices couldn't be completely left behind. They were very strong on issues of transparency, proper governance, proper procedure, fairness, and inclusion. They also built relational leverage. So they did not come in as a trusted party, which is often assumed about women who are included in negotiations, that because they are not seen as the ones committing the violence, that they'll be more trusted by other parties. And that wasn't the case, because the Women's Coalition didn't take a stance on what was seen as the key question, the constitutional question. Did Northern Ireland belong to the UK, or did it belong to Ireland? They didn't take a stance on this. And so everybody was very suspicious of them because they didn't know where they stood. But they talked to everybody. They slowly built up that trust so that eventually they made themselves indispensable to the chairman or mediators and the governments. They knew where all the other parties stood in a way that the government officials didn't. They could say, okay, there's room to move on these issues with these parties because they understood what the underlying interests were behind those positions. And so in that way, they made themselves a very, very indispensable part of the process to some of the most powerful people within the process. And so this was a government official who said they had very good relations with all the parties, so they could really help unlock situations. So they really moved the negotiations forward at really critical points in the process. They also built informational leverage. So they wrote position papers on everything. They didn't just write position papers, but they wrote solutions so that they could help anchor kind of the universe of possible options. So that even if they couldn't say, okay, we want X or else we're leaving, they could still help formulate what the potential options were. And this was a member of the Women's Coalition who said, have to say the British government and actually the Irish government fell in with us when we made these proposals, because you know what the secret was? We were drafting. None of the others were drafting. They were coming up with ideas and leaving it to the keeper of the pen and the two governments. We were writing it. So they were writing the solutions, and this was a profound source of power over shaping what happened. And then finally, they had moral authority. So they aired the dirty laundry of the process to the public and held the other parties to the account. They could say, we would have a deal if not for the behavior of X party. And so this placed a constraint on what the other parties could do because they would air that to the public. And so I think it's really important to note that even though the Women's Coalition was doing all of this, they still get constructed as the helpers to the process. just being the helpmate to the real negotiators. One member of the Women's Coalition said to me, people said we were the moms to the bold boys. So it was the men who were doing the real negotiations, and these women were just there to help the process along. And I think this, more than anything, perhaps illustrates the way, how intensely these processes are gendered, and the gendered meaning making of what counts as negotiation and who counts as negotiators. Because what the Women's Coalition were doing are kind of the central principles of interest-based negotiating, of principled negotiation, kind of what we know of the best practices of negotiation to find a compromise. That's what they were doing. It was the other parties who were doing that positional bargaining of, I'm not moving unless you give me X. And it was the Women's Coalition who were finding the space to engage these really key principles of negotiation. And still, they're just seen as the helpers to the process and not key negotiators themselves. So what have I argued? Embodied presence is not enough. Just being there does not necessarily give you the power to influence and change, though there's potential, as the Women's Coalition demonstrated. But gender functions as a power structure to create a hierarchy of value and meaning, that the elements coded as masculine are seen as relevant and essential, and that women and the feminized issues and practices they are seen to represent are devalued, limiting their avenues for influence and the ability to pursue certain outcomes. And why does this matter? Well, I think the words of a couple of my interlocutors say it far better than I can. I mean, one thing which strikes me very much looking back on it now is how little attention was paid to questions which have turned to be fundamental, you know? Questions of legacy, questions of reconciliation, sectarianism, things of that sort, things on which the Women's Coalition were always very strong. But for them, these questions of how to make Northern Ireland a more tolerant and livable and generous kind of place, they were the only people for whom this was a top priority. Or alternatively, Northern Ireland is a profoundly traumatized society and hasn't dealt with it at all. And so even just on the face of it, the ability for women or non-militarized actors, for their experience to be represented in peace negotiations and seen as essential for peace, that alone is important and valuable in and of itself. And these gendered hierarchies has implications for the ability for that to happen. But it's also more than that, because these feminized issues and what they're seen to represent are not just a slice of the process. They're not just about quote unquote women's issues, but they're actually fundamental issues that are fundamental to building more sustainable peace, but seen as less important and less significant than these militarized aspects. And then finally, it's important because peace processes are path dependent. These negotiations provide the blueprint for everything moving forward. And so if these things aren't addressed within the negotiation, as time goes on, as we've seen in Northern Ireland, the obstacles to addressing them only become higher and higher. So it's not just about the ability for women's experiences to be reflected, but also how this impacts everybody else in society and the capacity for these negotiations to result in enduring peace. And so with that, I'd love to hear your questions.